In today's videos, I will be explaining and showing, using old video footage, the prototypes which I created in the past, or at least some of them. Certainly not all of them. There were many, but only a few made it to the camera roll. So anyway, those are the ones I'm going to be showing today in motion picture. And just a reminder, they are earlier attempts. The very latest one that you'll see was built 6 years ago. Actually, no, it was built 7 years ago. I have not attempted to build one since, for reasons that are based upon the fact that I think they are dangerous to build alone, especially if they're likely to work. And I wasn't sure up until more recently, with the addition of the fact that they're very expensive to make. So, that is that. Enjoy the motion picture. I'll be narrating it for details. And first up, we have a coil on the ground, which is the true Omega coil of the pyramid. Well, this one's not true, but it is truer than depicted in the Alpha Omega image. That's an aluminium disc and a plastic frame. Jump cutting to some of my vacuum equipment, just a vacuum pump. Another one, an analog vacuum gauge, and a box of tricks, argon regulator, lots of miscellaneous things. Neon, a very high purity neon gas, which is used in the machines. A wax cast for a silver disc, a pure silver disc that was at the base of one of the Arcturian pyramids. That was a spare wax 3D print. A vacuum gauge that I particularly like to use for high vacuum, and more bits and pieces here and there. And another special box with more expensive stuff. I guess that's was made by a company in America and the States. Is one of the reflective discs at the top of the pyramid, and it's not that accurately made, but it was a first attempt, I guess, at trying to make one of the components as best I could, or have a company make it as best I could. And in that little tube is a hollow copper rod, a very narrow gauge copper tube, 0.2 millimeters, I think. And there's also, here's a water jet cut and laser cut copper rings, and for a much older attempt, and again the Omega coil. Those spirals represent the true Omega in the Alpha Omega picture, and that represents the true Alpha, which is the same as the Alpha, just a different angle. But again, these aren't accurate, but they're close enough for these illustrations. And that's my mercury pit. There's lots of mercury stored in there. Mercury is used for the file, the magical file, the magical element mercury, and that is an attempt to detect hyperdimensional fluctuations and convert them to audio using a germanium diode. Here's some frames just lying around the place, built for experiments. That one was built for an experiment, the smaller one, and the larger one was built to experiment outside of the vacuum on other different things. And that is another one, about the same dimensions, but it has a capstone and corners which is all hollow and soldered together using rods and copper plate. It's completely oxidized up by now as well. And yeah, these parts actually cost quite a bit to make, because this is professionally soldered together, because I wasn't able to do it to the accuracy I required. And here's another little version of a pyramid with a spiral in it. I like that one. It's empty in the inside, but it did have parts in it at some stage. Again, just guesswork. All just guesswork until I stopped guessing and started mathematically understanding. Yeah, but I do like that little one. Here's another one. Yes, the equilateral system, another version of that made of polycarbonate plastic, vacuum chamber. Just, again, the insides are missing, dismantled intentionally, actually, which is a strange story. The reason I intentionally take the parts out so they can't run properly, because they generate anomalous effects around them, strangely enough, hence why they're also stored in my dad's barn on a property far away from everything else. The salt case here, that's a salt casting for one of the components in the pyramid, which is actually supposed to be on the inside, not the outside, and so it's an epoxy salt cast, which is actually quite accurately made the way it came out for what I needed. It was quite impressive. But yes, I guess all for me to learn how to do these things so I can pull them. Another acrylic or PMMA case, the various similar model, different from the one depicted in the slideshow prior. Many of these were made in slightly varying proportions. Again, an attempt to find the right combination, but not understanding the mathematics. This is a hit and miss type methodology. But again, like trying to find a needle in that haystack. And it would be easier to find a needle in a haystack. And here we have the insides of that one that was just examined, the tube, the file. 2 coils. Again, it's different from the one in the slideshow. You'll notice it's different parts, but it looks the same. The coils are different. Different crystal, different tube, different mirrors. But to the untrained eye, it looks the same. And that is that. And moving on to the copper frame, also separated from the machine so that it can't work properly. And still managed not to oxidize all that time. And here's the latest prototype I attempted about 7 years ago, which cost the most and is housed inside an acrylic vacuum chamber. Just sitting there. It's no longer with me. It's somebody borrowed it and I haven't seen it since, but that's okay. And yes, that's the way it was, just hanging around the place. That's a really useful vacuum chamber, but in no way useful for making pyramids, and that will all be covered in future videos. But it cost quite a bit to make that thing, and I still use it today for many different tests. I quite like it as a vacuum chamber. It has a really nice viewing area, but it's just not useful for pyramids. The thickness of the plastic would never allow a machine to work, and the only electron configuration you can use for pyramids made of plastic are neon. That means you have to use fairly light elements, which are hard to come by and more expensive because they're not as common, such as diamond oscillators and diamond semiconductors, carbon semiconductors, and lithium fluoride crystals for the tube and whatnot. But yes, so that's the great vacuum chamber, which is I've become friends with it, but it's not seen as a pyramid because of its inhibiting nature. And here's the prototype naked. I think I'll just go through each part as illustrated and do close-ups of different parts to give you the idea. So this whole thing is about $18,000 to make all of these various parts and all the various process required to make the parts. It adds up very quick, especially if you've custom engineered different things and made in Australia. It's very expensive and very hard to convince companies. They're a little lazy over here. Attention to detail is not very good, so you have to really babysit some places to get the job done. I've learnt though now not to pay before the goods because they can come out bad and the companies don't care if they do or not. But so yes, I guess to start with the copper frame, it was all separate pieces sold together, water jet cut from copper sheet, angles put on the edges and then soldered together. And again, this prototype is not mathematically correct at all, but it is a rough approximation. And the first time I truly attempted the Arcturian pyramid, to the best I could. That capstone's hollow. It has a little hole in the top that's 0.3 millimeters in diameter to let some of the pressure out. And that was cast and machined and then polished and drilled, and the pin was soldered in, the hollow pin, to let the hyperdimensional pressure out the top as well as the bottom. And that's, yes, it's like that blocks the pressure in the pyramid. I think I'm going to try and focus in on that little hole. Probably barely, you can just see it. There is just a little wee hole in there, and just putting something like that in is actually a real tricky business. It's very, very hard to do. You can't drill a hole that small. You have to do other things. And this is inside. There's a disc up there. That's that glass thing that I showed. It's filled with mercury and salt. It is a passive reflector. It half reflects, half absorbs, and it comes to life at the same time because of the nature of the vibrating crystals and salt, creating or transducing pressure to electromagnetism. That's a crystal that I got faceted by a place in the Century Building in Melbourne, and that little thing is cut on its x-axis. The x-axis, I believe, is running from the apex to the center, if I remember correctly. But again, that's not going to oscillate. That was a misconception. I now know the correct dimensions to make a crystal to oscillate. It's not a pyramid, but it is a paraspherical teardrop-looking thing. But again, this is just placed in there. Again, this is way before I knew these things, or anything, before I knew This is a purely intuitively based prototype with not one calculation actually done, just intuition. A visual representation, but surprisingly close still. Miles apart, but close enough. Aluminium reflectors, they're not meant to be made of aluminium, but they are meant to be made of silver, but they are to keep the hyperdimensional field, the spherical bubble inside spinning around. The inside, there's two spherical bubbles, and that's the outer one, and that is to keep it inside and under pressure. Always the pressure. The pressure must be built up inside. That is your potential to operate with. And that is the Alpha Omega drive. That is roughly the true resemblance of what the Alpha Omega looks like. The practical functioning Alpha Omega, which is the male, I guess, the triangle, or this very steep triangle going through the pancake coil, creating potential, pure potential, the vortex pierced, like a black hole, a singularity, spinning around in there, creating potential at its very center and allowing hyperdimensional pressure to leak into this dimension and trapping it. That's the tip of the alpha. It has a gap. There is a gap there. There's a very specific reason for that gap. That gap is the beginning and the end of the circuitry. That is in part for electrons, but mostly for hyperdimensional energy, which obey similar laws to electrons. Similar, but not the same. And the mercury and salt tube, you can see a close-up of one of those tubes in there, just like the other pyramids. That is your central transducer and your modulator for the crystal oscillating above, previously depicted, and two magnets opposite that tube opposing with the void focused at the center of that tube, which encourages hyperdimensional energy to pop through because you are focusing the still zone being a line many times thinner than an atom where the actual still zone exists because you've cancelled out the field simply by using the opposing magnets. There is also a spherical vortex or a sphere rotating within those rings, and as you can see, they're fashioned to be a cross-section of a sphere. That's why they're curved, to keep the field inside spinning around. But again, the angles of all of these things are incorrect. Close enough, but not close enough to work. That's a germanium cell. These are germanium stacked cells. Before I understood how this little thing worked, I didn't realize it was just a germanium-based solar cell, which has to be germanium because it's based off the electron configuration of krypton. And the germanium is the way it's done. But that doesn't do anything because they're just... I knew it was germanium. I knew it and I was right, but that doesn't do anything because they're just all N. They're all NP germanium plates. That's a quartz disc. That's actually a quartz disc cut on its z-axis, synthetic quartz. And that was quite expensive to make, but that is pure synthetic quartz just sitting there on its z-axis, just really pretty. And that was a silver mirror. That's actually a plastic mirror down there. It's not silver, but originally for about $8,000 all up, we had a silver disc cast and drilled and lathed and polished, this beautiful thing that was sitting at the base there, which was since then sold and smelted down for its silver. So it was no longer required and turned back into money, more or less. So I've just for aesthetics, replaced it with a plastic cheap mirror down there. that does not have the curvature. The curvature is supposed to be focused on the crystal, but it doesn't have the curvature required. But it is slightly, but not enough. Not what it was. So, but that crystal is quite nice. It's always just incredibly clear and strong. And yes, another look at this mercury salt disc up the top there, and you can see the hollowness of the capstone. It's quite thick, but it is still hollow. And a front view of that very wide shot. You can see the plastic supports I've used, which are kind of in the wrong position, but they are PMMA, just acrylic laser cut plastic supports, which ideally you wouldn't use, but it's all right. It's not going to wreck the world. It's just that plastic slightly outgasses, and you don't want that. For properly made machines, my work was sloppy in the beginning. It got better and better and better and better, and now it's on par with something that could actually work. But this prototype fails in many respects in regards to that. You can see the salt crystals in the mercury there, and that mercury does conduct from one end to the other. Just again, we're looking at the plastic case for some reason. You can see the reflection in that copper. It looks pretty when it's shiny, even though this one is slightly tarnished, but it still looks nice. We did know the angle of the pyramid at this point. Surprisingly, that was guessed, and very, very accurately. It's just a very simple angle, but it was correct. But that's not enough. Much, much more was to come and was required. Again, this is not a mathematically based machine, purely intuitively based, but some of the maths was guessed correct, surprisingly enough. These machines have a very specific tolerance. If they're slightly out, they literally completely switch off. There is no room for a bad Q factor. And so therefore, if your machine is 1 millimeter out in dimension, it's going to be drastic. Its potency or accuracy will be drastically diminished. You can see the alpha going through the omega. So that's omega is spinning the whole field, that vortex spiral, and the alpha just sucking energy through it as it's spinning from the hyperdimensions, adding and adding and adding to the circuit as it feeds back in a vortex, while still adding. These vortex systems, which are all explained, are feedback addition. So adding and in a feedback loop, which loses less energy than is going in until it equalizes, and then you use that potential. You use release valves, little holes in the center of disks, to release the energy, to allow it to continually flow, but not deadlock in a static situation. And yes, that gap, even the length it is from those rings, is very important. It's all calculated by the ionic breakdown, or the breakdown voltage, so to speak, that little cell bears. To start these machines up, you need to ionize that area somehow, but once it starts, it will just keep running it. That little box is just to start the whole thing as well. Keep it flowing in one direction and keep things moving. Yes, it's a side view of what it looks like again. And I think finishing up by a low shot of the side as well. I hope you enjoyed. Until next time.